The silence in the throne room stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Every Valdari present processing the words they had just heard from this small human woman who had climbed their king's steps and spoken to him as no one had dared to speak in 300 years of his reign. King Theron studied Victoria with new eyes, his ancient mind weighing her words against everything he knew about warfare and conquest, and the nature of species who dared to challenge Valdari supremacy. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a tone that his generals had rarely heard from their emperor. "Impressive words," he said slowly, "and I will admit that your passion is convincing. But words are not the same as power. You speak of history, of atrocities committed by primitives fighting over a single world with primitive weapons. The Valdari command fleets that span multiple galaxies. We have technology that your species cannot even comprehend. What proof do you offer that humanity is anything more than clever talkers?" Victoria had been waiting for this moment, had planned for it from the instant she first read Theron's summons, because she knew that the Valdari would never respect words alone. They needed to see power, to feel it, to understand in their bones that humanity was not bluffing. She reached up to her collar and activated her communication device. "Captain Price," she said clearly, "execute protocol reverence." For a moment, nothing happened, and Victoria could see the skepticism growing on the faces of the Valdari War Council, could feel them dismissing her as a desperate bluffer, trying to frighten them with empty threats. Then the palace shook. Alarms began blaring throughout the throne room as Valdari technicians scrambled to their stations, their clawed fingers flying across holographic displays as they tried to understand what was happening in orbit above their world. "My king," one of the generals shouted, his voice carrying an edge of panic that seemed impossible from such a hardened warrior. "Ships are emerging from faster-than-light travel. Hundreds of them. They appeared without any warning. Our sensors did not detect their approach." Theron rose from his throne and strode to a massive view screen that flickered to life on the chamber wall, showing the space above Korvax Prime, and what he saw there made his yellow eyes widen with something that might have been the first genuine shock of his very long life. 300 human warships hung in perfect formation around his homeworld, vessels unlike anything the galactic community had ever seen from Earth, not the sleek trading ships and diplomatic transports that humanity had shown the universe for 60 years, but brutal, angular monsters of metal and weapons, ships designed for one purpose only, to destroy everything in their path. "They are heavily armed," another general reported, his voice trembling slightly as he read the sensor. "Data, weapons systems I have never seen before, shields that our scans cannot penetrate. And their formation, it is not defensive. They are positioned for a planetary assault." Victoria walked calmly to stand beside Theron at the view screen, her expression showing no surprise at what she was seeing, because she had known exactly what was coming. "For 60 years, she said quietly, "we have traded peacefully. We have avoided conflicts. We have let the galaxy believe we were too weak or too frightened to fight. But we were never weak. We were preparing, because we knew that eventually someone would come who saw our peace as an opportunity rather than a choice." The fleet parted on the view screen, and something else emerged from behind them. Something so massive that it made even the largest Valdari warships look like toys. It was a vessel easily twice the size of anything the Valdari Empire had ever constructed. A floating fortress, bristling with weapon systems that made the king's military advisors physically step backward from the screen, its hull black as space itself, and covered with devices that hummed with barely contained power. "That," Victoria said as she pointed at the massive ship, "is the Judgment. We built it in secret over 40 years, constructed in pieces across a dozen hidden facilities, and assembled in the deepest reaches of human space where no one would ever think to look. Its primary weapon is capable of cracking a planet's crust open like an egg." She turned to face Theron directly. We have 4 more like it under construction, she continued, and we have been developing weapons that make the Judgment look primitive. Weapons based on the same principles that our ancestors used to threaten our own extinction, scaled up for use against entire star systems. A holographic display activated nearby, and the face of Admiral Patricia Wells appeared, her gray hair pulled back severely, her expression carrying the grim determination of someone who had spent her entire career preparing for a war she hoped would never come. "General Cole," she said, "the fleet is in position and awaiting your orders. All weapons are charged and targeting systems are locked. We can begin planetary bombardment on your command." Victoria looked at Theron and saw something she had never expected to see on the face of a Valdari king: doubt. "You have a choice to make," she said, and her voice was calm, despite the enormity of what was happening around them. "You can accept that Earth is not yours to claim, that humanity will never submit to Valdari rule, and we can part ways peacefully, with no bloodshed on either side." She paused to let her words sink in. "Or, you can test us," she continued, "and learn firsthand why humans spent 60 years hiding their true strength from the galaxy. Why we chose to be seen as cowards rather than reveal what we had built. Why we fear war so deeply that we would rather be mocked and dismissed than risk starting one." Theron stared at the view screen, where the Judgment loomed over his throne world like a dark god of destruction, its weapons ports glowing with barely contained energy, and he understood with sudden clarity that this human woman was not bluffing, that everything she had told him about her species was true, that humanity had indeed been hiding their nature behind a mask of peace. "How?" he asked finally, his voice carrying a mix of outrage and grudging respect. "How did you build all of this without anyone knowing? Our spies reported that Earth had only a small defense fleet, barely enough to protect your core worlds." Victoria smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Your spies saw what we wanted them to see," she replied. "They saw trading vessels and research stations and diplomatic shuttles. They saw a species focused on commerce and culture and peaceful expansion. They never thought to look deeper, because they had already decided that we were harmless." She gestured at the fleet on the view screen. "Every one of those ships was built in disguise," she explained. "Their components manufactured in facilities that looked like civilian factories. Their crews trained in programs that appeared to be merchant marine academies. Their weapons tested in systems so remote that no one would ever investigate the energy signatures. We have been preparing for this moment for 6 decades, while the galaxy laughed at us." She took a step closer to the king. "We never wanted to use any of it," she said softly. "We built this fleet hoping that we would never have to fire a single shot, that someday it could be decommissioned and turned into scrap metal and forgotten as a relic of human paranoia. But we knew that hope was not a strategy, that peace requires strength to defend it, and that sooner or later someone like you would come along and force us to make a choice." Admiral Wells spoke again from the edge of the room. "The holographic display. General Cole," she said, "the Valdari fleet is attempting to reposition. Should we consider this a hostile action?" Victoria kept her eyes locked on Theron. "That depends," she said, "on what the king decides in the next few minutes." The fate of 2 civilizations hung in the balance as the most powerful ruler in the galactic core faced a choice he had never expected to make: whether to risk everything he had built against an enemy who clearly had nothing left to lose. The throne room of King Theron had become a battlefield without a single shot being fired. The tension thick enough to cut with a blade as the most powerful ruler in the galactic core stared at the view screen, showing a human fleet that had appeared from nowhere to challenge everything he believed about the universe. Victoria Cole stood beside him, waiting for his decision, her heart pounding in her chest despite the calm expression she maintained on her face, because she knew that the next few moments would determine whether billions of lives were saved or lost, whether humanity would emerge from this confrontation as partners or as the monsters their ancestors had been. Theron's generals muttered among themselves, some arguing for immediate attack despite the obvious danger, others counseling retreat and regrouping, but the king himself remained silent, his ancient yellow eyes fixed on the massive warship that hung in space above his world, like a promise of annihilation. "You are not bluffing," he said finally, his voice carrying none of the arrogance that had filled it when Victoria first entered his throne room. "This is not a trick or a desperate gamble. You truly would destroy everything I have built if I forced you to." Victoria shook her head slowly. "I would hate every moment of it," she replied. "I would carry the guilt for the rest of my life and beyond. I would mourn every Valdari life lost as if they were my own people, because they would be innocent victims of a war started by rulers who should have known better." She paused and let her voice soften slightly. "But yes," she continued, "I would give the order and your throne world would burn and your empire would crumble, and humanity would become the very thing we have spent centuries trying not to be. Because when faced with the choice between our principles and our survival, we will always choose survival, even if it destroys our souls." Theron turned away from the view screen and walked slowly back toward his throne, his massive form moving with a wariness that seemed to age him before Victoria's eyes. And when he reached the top of the steps, he did not sit down, but instead stood looking out over his court, his generals and advisors who had served him faithfully for centuries. "In 300 years of rule," he said quietly, "no one has ever spoken to me the way you have spoken today. No one has ever dared to climb these steps uninvited. No one has ever looked me in the eye and promised to destroy everything I love without a trace of fear in their heart." He turned to face Victoria. "I have conquered 17 star systems," he continued. "I have fought wars against species who outnumbered us 10 to 1. I have faced enemies who had technology we could barely understand, and I have won every single time, because I understood something fundamental about warfare, that victory goes to those who are willing to pay any price." Victoria nodded slowly, understanding where he was going. "And today," Theron said, "I have met a species who is willing to pay a higher price than the Valdari, a species who would sacrifice their own souls rather than submit to conquest, a species who fears war so deeply that they have become the most dangerous warriors in the galaxy." He descended the steps until he stood before Victoria as an equal rather than a conqueror addressing a supplicant. "The Valdari understand strength," he said. "We have always believed that those who avoid conflict are weak, that peace is a luxury enjoyed by those who cannot fight. But you have shown me something different today. You have shown me that there is a greater strength in building power and choosing not to use it, in being capable of terrible destruction and walking away instead." He extended his massive hand in the human gesture of greeting that Victoria had shown him in their earlier correspondence. "Be no war today, General Cole," he said. "Earth will remain sovereign and independent. The Valdari will withdraw our demands and issue a formal statement recognizing humanity as an equal member of the galactic community." Victoria took his hand and felt the rough scales against her palm, felt the strength in his grip that could have crushed her bones without effort, and she allowed herself to finally breathe, to let go of the terrible weight she had carried since reading his summons weeks ago. "That is all we ever wanted," she said simply. Theron released her hand and turned to address his court. "Spread the word throughout the Empire," he commanded. "Humanity is not to be threatened or challenged or provoked. They are to be treated with the same respect we would show any species capable of standing against us. And any Valdari who violates this decree will answer to me personally." The generals bowed in acknowledgement, their earlier contempt for humans replaced by something that looked remarkably like respect. And Victoria felt a surge of hope that perhaps this day would mark the beginning of something better for both their species. She walked back down the steps of the throne, with her honor guard falling into formation around her, their relief visible in the slight relaxation of their shoulders, and the way they carried their weapons just a little less tightly. And as she reached the entrance to the chamber, she turned back for one final look at the king who had threatened to conquer her world. "King Terran," she called out, and he looked down at her with curiosity in his eyes. "I hope that someday our species can be friends rather than simply neighbors who have agreed not to kill each other. I hope that we can learn from each other and grow together, because I truly believe that the galaxy would be better if the Valdari and humanity worked together rather than apart." Theron considered her words for a long moment. Remarkable happened. He smiled, showing rows of sharp teeth that would have terrified any other species, but somehow seemed almost warm in this context. "Perhaps we will, General Cole," he said. "You have taught me that I still have things to learn about the universe, and that is a rare gift for someone as old as I am. Perhaps someday I will visit Earth, and you can teach me more about this strange species that fears war so much they became masters of it." Victoria returned his smile and nodded respectfully before walking out of the throne room and into the sunlight of Korvax Prime, a world that had come within minutes of destruction and been saved by nothing more than words and will, and the desperate hope that violence was not the only answer. The shuttle carried her back to the Relentless, where Captain Price waited on the bridge, his face showing the strain of the hours he had spent preparing for a battle that might have ended everything. And when Victoria stepped onto the bridge, "Command deck," he simply nodded at her with relief in his eyes. Admiral Wells appeared on the communication screen. "The Valdari fleet is standing down," she reported. "They are returning to standard patrol positions, and their weapon systems are powering off. It appears that whatever you said in there actually worked." Victoria walked to the view screen and looked out at the Judgment and the 300 warships that surrounded it. This terrible, beautiful fleet that she had hoped would never have to fire a single shot. "It worked because we were willing to back up our words," she said quietly, "and because we were fortunate enough to face an enemy who could recognize strength even when it came in an unexpected form." She turned to Daniel. "Take us home," she ordered, "and send a message to Earth. Tell them that the crisis is over, and that we have achieved peace. Tell them that humanity showed the galaxy exactly who we are today, not conquerors or cowards, but something in between. Something that might just be worth admiring." The fleet jumped to faster-than-light speed, and the stars streaked past the view screen, as Victoria stood alone at the observation window, thinking about everything that had happened and everything that still lay ahead. She did not know what the future would bring, or whether the peace she had won today would last forever or crumble tomorrow. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Humanity had proven that they could face the darkness in their own nature and choose the light. That they could build weapons of terrible destruction and decide not to use them. That they could be feared and respected, and perhaps even loved. That was worth fighting for, even if the fighting was done with words instead of weapons. And somewhere deep in the heart of Earth's secret military command, the engineers and scientists who had built the Judgment and its sister ships began the long, slow process of putting their terrible creations into storage, hoping that they would never be needed, knowing that they would always be ready if they were. Because humanity had learned a long time ago that peace was not the absence of the ability to wage war. It was the choice not to. And that choice, made fresh every single day by billions of people across hundreds of worlds, was the greatest strength humanity had ever possessed. Victoria stood on the steps of the Valdari throne and looked out at a room full of warriors who had never known true defeat, generals who had conquered worlds and believed themselves to be the pinnacle of military power, and she felt something rising inside her that she had kept buried for most of her adult life. A rage, born from the knowledge of what her species had done to itself, and what they could do again if pushed far enough. 200 years ago, she began, her voice carrying through the silent chamber with perfect clarity. Before humans ever left our homeworld, before we knew that alien life existed, before we had any enemy except ourselves, we fought a war that killed 70 million people in 6 years. She paused to let that number sink in, watching as the Valdari exchanged uncertain glances, their understanding of scale struggling to process such a figure. 70 million, she repeated, not soldiers, not warriors, but people, families, children, cities burned to ash in single nights. We invented weapons that could destroy everything our civilization had built over 10,000 years. And we used those weapons on each other, not because we had to, but because we were angry, because we were afraid, because we had convinced ourselves that the only way to survive was to destroy our enemies completely. She took another step up toward the throne. We called it a world war because it spread across our entire planet, she continued. Every nation, every continent, every ocean became a battlefield. And when it was over, we swore we would never let it happen again. But we were lying to ourselves, because barely 20 years later, we did it all over again. And this time, we killed even more. King Terran shifted on his throne, his expression no longer showing amusement or contempt, but something closer to fascination, like a predator who had suddenly realized the prey before him was not what he expected. Before that great war, Victoria pressed on. We fought another conflict that killed 20 million people in just 4 years. And in that war, we invented weapons designed to make soldiers drown in their own lungs. We sent an entire generation of young men to die in muddy trenches fighting over a few meters of ground. We watched them be torn apart by machine guns and artillery and poison gas. And we kept sending more, because we could not admit that the killing was pointless. She was climbing higher now, her voice growing stronger with each step. We have fought wars over religion and territory and resources and pride, and sometimes for reasons that made no sense at all, she said. We have committed genocides that wiped out entire peoples. We have enslaved millions of our own species based on the color of their skin. We have burned cities and salted fields and poisoned wells to ensure that our enemies could never recover. She stopped just a few steps below the throne itself, close enough to see the flicker of uncertainty in Theron's yellow eyes. You want to know what makes humans different from every other species you have conquered? She asked, and her voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the vast room. It is not our technology or our tactics or our numbers. It is the fact that we have spent centuries trying to overcome the darkness in our own nature. We know exactly what we are capable of because we have done it all before. Every atrocity you can imagine and many you cannot, we have inflicted upon ourselves. She spread her hands to encompass the entire throne room. Your wars are clean, she said, and there was something almost like pity in her voice. You fight over territory and resources, you accept surrenders and negotiate terms. Your populations survive to be integrated into the empire. Your infrastructure remains intact. You understand war as a tool for achieving political objectives. Her expression hardened. That is not how humans wage war. The silence in the throne room had become absolute. Every Valdari frozen in place as they listened to this small human woman describe horrors that made their own bloody history seem almost civilized by comparison. When humans fight for survival, Victoria continued, we do not stop until the enemy is completely destroyed. We do not accept surrenders because we do not trust them. We do not negotiate terms because we do not believe in them. We burn everything, kill everyone, and salt the earth so that nothing can ever grow there again. She took the final steps until she stood face to face with King Theron, her eyes level with his, despite the difference in their heights. You have conquered species who fought with honor and rules and expectations of mercy, she said. You have never faced an enemy who would sacrifice everything, absolutely everything, to ensure that their children survive. have never fought a species that would rather destroy itself than submit to domination. Theron stared at her for a long moment, his ancient mind processing what she had told him. And when he spoke, his voice had lost much of its earlier arrogance. "You claim to fear war," he said slowly, "yet you describe yourself as the most dangerous warriors in the galaxy. Which is the truth?" "Both," Victoria replied without hesitation. "We fear war because we understand it. We understand it because we have lived it. We have lived it because we could not stop ourselves. And now we spend every day of our lives trying to be better than our ancestors. Trying to prove that we can choose peace, even when war would be easier." She leaned closer to the king. "But make no mistake," she said, and her voice carried an edge of pure steel. "If you threaten our worlds, if you harm our people, if you give us no choice, we will show you what humanity looks like when we stop trying to be civilized. We'll reach down into the darkest parts of our history and pull out every weapon, every tactic, every brutal strategy that our ancestors used to survive. And we will unleash them upon you with a fury that your empire has never seen." Her eyes burned with an intensity that made even the mighty King Theron lean back slightly on his throne. "We will not fight you the way other species fight," she promised. "We will not meet your fleets in honorable battle and accept defeat gracefully. We will hide in asteroids and attack your supply lines. We will infiltrate your worlds and destroy your infrastructure. We will turn your own populations against you with propaganda and lies. We will poison your food and water. We will assassinate your leaders and their families. We will do every terrible thing that humans have ever done to each other. And we will not stop until you are so thoroughly broken that you can never threaten us again." She stepped back, and her voice softened. Fire in her eyes remained. "We do not want this," she said. "We have worked so hard to become better than we were. We have built a society based on peace and cooperation and the belief that intelligent beings can resolve their differences without violence. We want to trade with you and learn from you and grow alongside you as partners in this vast galaxy." She paused and let her words hang in the air. "But we will never, ever submit to conquest," she finished. "And if you force us to choose between our principles and our survival, we will choose survival. And you will learn why every human child studies the history of our wars, not to celebrate them, but to remember what we must never become again, unless we absolutely have to." King Theron sat in silence for a long moment, his war council looking to him for guidance. And Victoria stood before him, waiting for his response, knowing that the next few minutes would determine the fate of billions. The Valdari throne world of Korvax Prime appeared on the view screen like a jewel of conquest, floating in the darkness of space, its surface covered with massive cities and monuments built to celebrate 10,000 years of military victories. And as the Relentless entered orbit, Victoria Cole felt the weight of what she was about to do settle firmly on her shoulders. Captain Daniel Price stood beside her on the bridge, his face showing the tension that everyone aboard felt, but no one dared speak aloud, for they were entering the heart of an empire that had crushed countless civilizations, and they were doing so with a single ship and a handful of Marines. "The landing coordinates have been received," the communications officer reported. "They are directing us to the Imperial Plaza, directly in front of the palace." Victoria nodded and turned to her honor guard, 12 Marines who had volunteered for this mission, knowing full well they might not return. And she saw in them the same resolute determination that filled her heart. Their eyes not fear, but determination, the same stubborn refusal to back down that had defined humanity since the first cave dweller picked up a rock and decided to fight instead of flee. "Remember why we are here," she told them, her voice calm and steady. "We are not here to start a war. We are here to prevent one. But if things go badly, you will follow my lead and trust that I know what I am doing." "Yes, General," they responded in unison, and their voices carried absolute conviction. The shuttle descended through the atmosphere of Korvax Prime, and Victoria watched through the window as the landscape revealed itself, vast military installations stretching to the horizon. Training grounds where thousands of Valdari soldiers drilled in perfect formation, and everywhere statues and monuments celebrating conquest and domination. "They want us to be intimidated," Daniel observed quietly. "Everything about this world is designed to make visitors feel small and weak." "They have made a mistake," Victoria replied without looking away from the window. "Because everything I see tells me they have never truly been tested. They have conquered species who could not fight back. And they have convinced themselves that this makes them invincible." The shuttle landed in the Imperial Plaza, and Victoria stepped out first, her boots touching alien soil as she surveyed the scene before her. And what she saw was exactly what she had expected. A grand display of power meant to overwhelm and subjugate before a single word was spoken. The processional avenue leading to the palace was lined with massive statues depicting Valdari warriors standing triumphant over fallen enemies, each sculpture showing a different species brought low by imperial might. And Victoria walked past them without giving them more than a glance, refusing to be impressed by monuments to other people's suffering. Valdari guards flanked the pathway, their armor gleaming in the harsh air. Sunlight, their weapons held ready as if expecting the small group of humans to suddenly attack, and their yellow eyes followed Victoria with a mixture of curiosity and contempt that she felt like heat against her skin. At the entrance to the throne room stood a Valdari official in ceremonial robes, his expression making clear that he considered this duty beneath his station, and he spoke to Victoria in a tone that dripped with condescension. "The king has graciously agreed to receive you," he announced, though many advised him against wasting his time on representatives of such an insignificant species. Victoria smiled pleasantly and walked past him without responding, leaving him sputtering in outrage at her apparent disrespect. And her Marines followed close behind, their faces carefully blank, but their eyes alert for any sign of danger. The throne room was designed to crush the spirit of anyone who entered it. A vast chamber with ceilings so high they disappeared into shadow, walls covered with the banners of subjugated worlds, and at the far end a throne sitting atop a pyramid of steps that forced all visitors to look up at the king like supplicants begging for mercy. King Theron sat upon that throne like a god surveying insects, his massive form radiating power and absolute authority, his copper-colored scales gleaming under carefully positioned lights. And around him stood his war council, generals who had personally commanded the destruction of civilizations. Victoria walked forward until she reached the base of the steps, and then she stopped and stood perfectly still, her back straight, her chin raised, her eyes meeting the king's gaze without a trace of submission or fear. So, Theron spoke, and his voice rumbled through the chamber like distant thunder. "Earth sends a female to speak for them. How fitting for a species that fears war. I expected perhaps an army, or a fleet, or at least a delegation of your most powerful leaders. Instead, I receive a single woman and a handful of soldiers who look like children playing dress-up." Laughter echoed through the throne room as the Valdari court expressed their amusement at the king's words, and Victoria let them laugh, let them enjoy their moment of superiority, because she knew that laughter would not last much longer. "Your summons spoke of submission," Victoria said when the laughter finally died down, her voice carrying clearly through the vast space. "I am here to inform you that Earth will not comply with your demands. Not now, not ever." The amusement in the room shifted to surprise and then to anger as the Valdari processed the audacity of this small human woman refusing their king to his face, and several generals reached for their weapons before Theron raised a hand to stop them. "You misunderstand your position," Theron said, and his voice had grown colder, harder, like stone grinding against stone. Little corner of space for 6 decades. You have no great fleet that we have seen, no conquered territories to prove your strength, no reputation among the warrior races. You are nothing but peaceful traders and frightened diplomats who run from every conflict. He leaned forward on his throne, his yellow eyes boring into her with predatory intensity. The Valdari have fought 1,000 wars, he continued. We have crushed empires that existed before your species learned to make fire. I have personally killed more enemies than your entire military could count. What could you possibly do to resist us? What could one human female say that would change anything about the reality of your weakness? Victoria remained perfectly still through his entire speech, letting his words wash over her like water against rock. And when he finished, she did something that made every Valdari in the room freeze with shock. She began to climb the steps. The guards moved to intercept her, but Theron raised his hand again, curious to spite himself about what this strange human intended to do. And Victoria continued her steady ascent, her boots echoing against the ancient stone with each step she took toward the most powerful ruler in the galactic core. You speak of war as if you understand it, she said as she climbed, and her voice had changed, grown harder, carrying an edge that made even the battle-hardened generals shift uncomfortably. You speak of conquest and victory and the crushing of empires as if these things make you strong. She stopped halfway up the steps and turned to address the entire court, her small human form somehow commanding the attention of every Valdari in the room. Let me tell you what war really is, she said, and there was something in her eyes now that made King Theron lean back slightly on his throne. Let me tell you what humans know about destruction and suffering and the depths to which a species can sink when survival is at stake. The throne room fell completely silent as Victoria Cole prepared to deliver a history lesson that would change everything the Valdari thought they knew about the quiet, peaceful humans who had hidden themselves away for 60 years. She looked up at King Theron and smiled, and there was no warmth in that smile at all. You have no idea what you have awakened, she said softly, but you are about to learn. The year was 2347, and humanity had been part of the Galactic Concord for exactly 62 years, though most alien species barely noticed their existence at all. For humans had done something that puzzled every warrior race in the known universe. They had chosen peace when they could have chosen conquest. And this single decision had earned them a reputation that would have made their ancestors laugh with bitter irony. The reputation of cowards. General Victoria Cole stood on the command bridge of the United Earth vessel Relentless, her hands clasped behind her back, as she stared at the holographic message floating before her eyes. And the words it contained made her jaw tighten with an anger she had not felt in many years. For King Theron of the Valdari Empire had sent a summons that read more like a demand for surrender than a diplomatic invitation. She was 53 years old, with dark hair that had begun to show streaks of silver near her temples. Eyes carried the weight of 3 decades spent in military service to Earth and her colonies. But those eyes had never shown fear. Not when she commanded troops during the Mars Colony Uprising, not when she led the defense of Titan Station against raiders, and certainly not now as she read the arrogant words of an alien king who believed humans were nothing more than frightened children hiding in a corner of the galaxy. Captain Daniel Price walked up beside her and read the message over her shoulder, his expression growing darker with each passing moment, until he finally let out a long breath and shook his head in disbelief at what he was seeing. "Can you believe this?" he asked, his voice carrying a tone of frustrated amazement. "He actually thinks we will just bow down and accept Valdari oversight of our entire civilization. Does he have any idea who he is dealing with?" Victoria did not answer immediately. Instead, she continued to study the message, reading between the lines. Lines to understand what King Theron truly wanted. And what she found there was simple and ancient and utterly predictable. For the Valdari were a proud species who measured worth in conquest and saw peace as weakness. And they had looked at humanity's 60 years of quiet trade and careful diplomacy and concluded that Earth was ripe for domination. The Defense Council wants to send a response, Daniel continued when she remained silent. They are debating what to say, how to phrase our refusal in a way that will not provoke open war. But honestly, Victoria, I do not think words alone will matter to someone like Theron. He respects only one thing. Power, Victoria finished his thought, and her voice was quiet, but carried an edge that made Daniel straighten his posture instinctively. He respects power, and the willingness to use it, and for 60 years we have shown the galaxy neither of those things. She turned away from the message and walked to the main viewport, where the stars stretched endlessly in every direction, each point of light representing countless worlds and species and civilizations that had formed their opinions about humanity, based on limited information and comfortable assumptions. Daniel followed her and stood at her side, waiting for her to share whatever thoughts were forming behind those intense eyes. For he had served with Victoria for 15 years, and knew that silence from her usually preceded something significant. The Valdari have conquered 17 star systems, Victoria said finally, her gaze fixed on the distant stars. They have fought wars for 3,000 years and built an empire on the bones of species who could not resist them. And in all that time, they have never encountered anything like us. What do you mean? Daniel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Victoria turned to face him, and there was something in her expression that he had rarely seen. Determination, and something else that might have been called fury if it were not so carefully controlled beneath the surface. They have never fought a species that chose peace, not because they were weak, but because they were terrified of their own strength, she said. They do not understand what it means to be human, to carry the memory of every war we have ever fought, to know in our blood and bones what we are capable of when we stop holding ourselves back. She paused and looked back at the stars. The Council will debate and negotiate and try to find diplomatic solutions, and I respect that, she continued. But someone needs to go to Korvax Prime and look King Theron in the eye and make him understand something that no alien species has ever grasped about humanity. And what is that? Daniel asked. That our kindness is a choice, Victoria replied, and her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Our peace is a choice. Our restraint is a choice. Day we choose not to become what our history proves we can become. But if someone forces our hand, if someone threatens everything we love, we will make a different choice, and the galaxy will learn why humans fear war more than any species alive. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine despite the warmth of the bridge, for he had studied human history extensively and knew exactly what Victoria was talking about. The wars that had killed tens of millions, the weapons that could destroy cities in seconds, the atrocities committed by ordinary people when they believed their survival was at stake. You want to go yourself, he said, and it was not a question. Victoria nodded slowly, her decision already made. Someone has to show them, she said, and I would rather it be me than someone who might actually want a war, because the truth is, Daniel, I will do everything in my power to prevent bloodshed, but if prevention fails, I will not hesitate to show King Theron exactly why that was such a terrible mistake on his part. She walked back to the command console and began composing her message to the Defense Council, informing them that she would personally answer the Valdari summons, and as her fingers moved across the interface, Daniel watched her with a mixture of admiration and concern. Do you really think you can change his mind? He asked. The Valdari have been conquerors for millennia. Why would one human woman make any difference? Victoria paused her typing and looked up at him with the ghost of a smile on her face. "Because I am not going to argue with him," she replied. "I am going to tell him the truth about what humanity really is. And if he is even half as intelligent as his reputation suggests, he will realize that some prey is not worth hunting. And if he is not that intelligent," Daniel pressed, "then I will have to educate him," Victoria said simply, and she returned to her message with a finality that told Daniel. The conversation was over. 3 days later, the Relentless departed Earth orbit with a crew of 200 and an honor guard of 12 Marines, carrying humanity's answer to a king who had never been told no. And as the ship jumped to faster-than-light speed, Victoria Cole sat alone in her quarters and reviewed everything she knew about the Valdari, their history, their culture, their strengths and weaknesses, preparing herself for a confrontation that would determine whether the next century brought peace or devastation. She did not sleep that night, and when morning came, she was ready.